First I'm going to say something about the similarities between the Druids of Britain and the Brahmins of India. Many writers have alluded to parallels between these two cultures. One, Peter Bereford Ellis, author and Celtic historian, writes in his book The Druids, 1994, that the Indo-European hypothesis is important to any study of the Celts and is one to which we must return as a means of explaining the extraordinary parallels and similarities between Celtic and Hindu cultures, occurring in the areas of language, law, religious attitudes, mythology, music and caste. He speaks of the Indo-European hypothesis because British culture can't be understood in isolation from we know, for example, that our language, in fact all the languages of Europe have originally come from Sanskrit. So the English language is part of the Indo-European languages. The same as our traditions, our religious traditions, they're part of the Indo-European traditions, which are not only found in Britain but found throughout Europe. So scholars have classified them Indo-European because of the connection with the traditions of India. So in the same book he includes the following statements by his own mentors, Dillon and Chadwick, who say, "We may now go further and say that the Druid and Brahmin were heirs to a common tradition of culture and learning. The Indo-European origin of Irish metre and striking similarities between the Hindu and Irish system of law, which also point to Indo-European origin, go a long way towards proving that the Irish Philid and therefore the Celtic Druids were heirs to the same tradition as the Brahmins." Now, a French author, Henry Herbert, he wrote in his book The Greatness and Decline of the Celts, 1934, that the priesthoods, Druid and Brahmin, are not merely very similar, but exactly the same, and they are preserved nowhere so completely as at the two opposite ends of the Indo-European world. So although these scholars allude to similarities between Druids and Brahmins, or Celts and Hindus, they're often not very specific in exactly what those similarities are. And in fact, I've never seen a list of all the similarities compiled. So a few years ago, I spent a few months compiling my own lists. One of them was of the similarities between the Druids and the Brahmins. And I found that there were 150, or at least I listed 150 similarities. Now, I could have gone on. I could have probably got it to 200 or 300. But I stopped after 150 because I spent a few months just getting it, compiling the list to that extent. And I thought there's no point in going further, because when you can show 150 similarities, you're showing that the two are exactly the same. So what were the similarities between Druids and Brahmins? Well, one probably the biggest, probably the most important, is that both the Druids of Britain and the Brahmins of India divided their society into 4 social and 4 spiritual orders. This is actually the hallmark of Vedic culture. Now, we've seen in India that there are 4 social and 4 spiritual orders. For example, we have the Brahmins, who are the priestly class. We have the Kshatriyas, we have the warriors. We have the Vaishyas, who are the merchants. And we have the Sudras, who are the workers. So, in Europe, Caesar, for example, said there were only 2 classes. There were warriors and priests. Society was divided into 2 classes. But you can never have a society made up just of warriors and priests, because there must always be farmers. There must always be shopkeepers. There must always be business people. So therefore, even though they may not be mentioned by people like Caesar, we know that they exist. So we know that that gives us 3. And obviously there's the working class who support the other groups. You know, ordinary working people. In India they're called Sudras. So when Caesar says there are only 2 groups in Europe, priests and warriors, we know that the Vaishyas and the Sudras are also there. So there are 4 classes. The 4 spiritual orders are Brahmachari, householder, grihastha, forest dweller, vanaprastha, and sannyas. And we find those same orders in ancient Britain. We find the student. For example, in the Bardic tradition, a young boy would leave his home at a very early age, the age of 4 or 5, and he would go to study with his master. Sometimes in a hermitage in the forest, sometimes in a cave, usually in a secluded place. But he would leave the parents, and then everything that he learned would be taught to him by his master or guru. Now, in the Bardic tradition, the student would stay with the master up until the age of 25. And it's said that during that time, they would memorize 20,000 sacred verses by heart. And actually, Subhash Kark, a very famous Hindu scholar, he calculated that the original verses of the Vedas numbered 20,000. Leaving that aside, we see a relation with the Brahmacharis of India, that they would stay with their guru up until the age of 25, where they would then get married. They would become grihastas. So in the Bardic tradition, one would become a bard, one would become a teacher. Bard means teacher. And the bards of Britain, they taught all forms of knowledge. And in fact, not only spiritual knowledge, but whatever a person learned, they learned from a bard. And if you learned your trade from anyone but a bard, it was not recognized. And the same in India. The Brahmins of India not only taught spiritual knowledge, they taught all forms of knowledge. They were teachers. Now, many Roman historians, they describe the Druids as being forest dwellers. And Vanaprastha, the 3rd order of the spiritual orders in India, it means forest dweller. And what would happen in India is that after 25 years or 30 years in married life, the husband would then go with the wife into the forest, and they would live a very simple life, practicing austerities, meditating, worshipping the deity, but living a very simple spiritual existence. So in India, these are called Vanapras. Now, many Roman historians, they describe the Druids as being forest dwellers. And this exactly relates to the Vanapras of India, because after spending 25 or 30 years as a bard, as a teacher, teaching in the colleges or, teaching the various trades, they would then retire to the forest. And in the bardic tradition, it says that they would go to the forest for 30 years, which is exactly the length of time it says in the Vedas, or recommends that one should go to the forest, in order to become renounced, in order to just live a simple life. And prepare. It's a sort of a preparation for the final stage. Now, in India, the final stage is called sannyas. That after spending 30 years in the forest, 25, 30 years in the forest, the Brahmin would then accept the renounced order of life in old age, usually in the last quarter of his life. And in old age he would be given a staff. And the wife would then return home to her children, to live with her own children. Now, in the bardic tradition, we find exactly the same thing. That they spend up to 30 years in the forest, and then the bard will take the final order, and this final order, the bard is given a staff. Sometimes in the bardic tradition, it's called a wand, but it's the same thing. He then carries a staff, and the wife goes home and back to the family. So the highest order is considered to be the final one. That is the order of Druid, which corresponds to the order of sannyas. And it is only when they take that final stage that they then become advisors to kings, because they're considered to be very learned. They've had 25 years with their master, learning all the sacred verses by heart. They've had 25 or 30 years teaching, and they've had years in the forest. And then in their old age, in their full wisdom, they then become magistrates and advisors to kings. And we see exactly the same things in both traditions, in India and in Britain. So we see exactly the same for social and for spiritual orders. So in India, this is known as Varnashram Dham. So the same orders, the same social and spiritual orders existed in Britain. Now, another thing is that, so that's one similarity. That's only one out of 150 similarities between Druids and Brahmins. Another is that they performed ritual sacrifice with fire, and ritual and ceremonial actually, and even marriages were conducted in this way in Britain with ceremonial fire sacrifice. And it's described in the Bardic writings that they would make a fire, and they would throw various types of grains and foodstuffs into the fire while they were reciting sacred prayers, which would relate to the mantras. And they called the god of the fire Agni, the same as in India. Now, this hasn't been recorded as Agni, but we can see it's the same, because in the Bardic writings, the god of the sacred fire is called Gni. But that's just down to pronunciation, Agni. You see? So the Brahmins of India and the Druids of Britain, they divided their society into 4 social, 4 spiritual orders. They performed fire sacrifice. They had 20,000 sacred verses, which they learnt by heart. Nothing was written down. The Brahmins of India wrote nothing down. They passed all of their knowledge, sacred knowledge, were in the form of codified verses, Sanskrit verses, which were passed down from master to disciple, and the same in Britain. They also had the same appearance. They wore cotton robes. They walked bare feet in the temple or in their sacred circles. They sat cross-legged. They both played cymbals and drums. They had a Sika. The Druids of Britain, they called their Sika a tonsure. And when they converted to Christianity, the Christians, the first thing they did was cut off their Sika, which they called the devil's lock. But the Christian monks, they wished to be respected in the same way as Druids, and so they kept a tonsure, but the opposite way round. They shaved their head in the place where the Druids grew theirs. So there are many exact similarities between the Brahmins of India and the Druids of Britain.